Welcome to another episode of The Brand Called You, podcast and podcast show that brings you leadership lessons, knowledge, experience, and wisdom from thousands of successful individuals from around the world. I'm your host, Ashutosh Garg, and today I'm privileged to welcome a very senior, accomplished, and respected professional from Long Beach, California, USA, Mr. Alex Nesbitt. Alex, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Thank you. Alex is a strategy and technology consultant. He's a transformation coach, and he's a CEO and board advisor. Alex has worked with several leading companies. So, Alex, before we talk about coaching, tell me about your own journey in brief.
Sure. I'll kind of collapse the front end and kind of get to the more interesting part at the back end of the discussion.
Yeah.
I was industrial engineering from Stanford. Went to work with a company called the Boston Consulting Group, where I spent about 15 years. Ended up as a partner, managing director, led their West Coast industrial goods practice. Worked with lots of mostly big companies, strategy, large scale change, those sorts of things. Left there to do a startup of my own. Founded a company called Same Day, which is really a logistics technology company. We grew quite rapidly until our e-commerce companies started going bankrupt on us, and we pivoted to time-critical spare parts. So that was kind of my full-on, CEO experience. It was largely in there, and then kind of semi-retired after that, and started doing more independent consulting, which kind of led to coaching CEOs and helping people with change. Well, really, kind of the interesting part of the journey happened probably 5 or 6 years ago for me, which was I was having dinner with one of my coaching clients, a CEO. We'd had a good run together. We'd kind of grown his company from 40 million to about 300 million. Took his EBITDA from basically break even to about 80 million a year. So it was really a good success story. But we were having dinner together, and he asked me this question, which was, so how do I build a competitive advantage like IKEA? How do they do it? How did they do it? And I kind of gave my standard answer, that's because they have this coherent business system and blah, blah, blah. And I realized I really didn't know. I was really sort of felt like I was kind of just making it up, and really started digging into the origins of advantage, started studying the backstories of companies like IKEA, Walmart, Southwest, anybody who had really some recognized competitive advantage. And what I found was kind of a pattern that surprised me, which was that they were successful largely because at some point in their past, they'd had a significant constraint placed upon them, either by the outside market or by the management team. Somehow it had forced innovation to occur, and in pretty significant innovation that moved the sort of the company from being what it was to being something that was very different than the status quo. And I was curious to see just that sort of pattern somewhere else beyond business. So I went into complexity theory, thermodynamics, neuroscience, architecture, everywhere kind of looking to understand sort of how do these kinds of advantage structures emerge. In that process, I discovered this idea from neuroscience called Enacting, which is the idea that we enact our world around us and the world enacts us. And it's a much more dynamic kind of perception than sort of the traditional kind of cause and effect model. And that became sort of my moniker, if you will, for how I think about what leadership should be and what strategy should be. And if I kind of break that down into something that's probably more tractable for people in understanding, I think of it as kind of leadership leads to, has the job of creating conditions. Conditions create behaviors. Behaviors create results. Right? And that's kind of the chain that we're trying to produce. And it's really more of perhaps a leadership model that's more like gardening or farming, in the sense that we can't control what happens, but we can create conditions where good things can happen, and we can let success emerge from the conditions that we create, which really led me to thinking a lot about how do I help people do that as leaders and as CEOs? How do I help them create conditions that lead to success? And that's kind of the framing principle that I've been working with for the last 2 years.
Wow, what an amazing journey. Thank you for sharing this. So let's talk a little bit about coaching.
Sure.
And my first question to you is, what are some of the common challenges you see CEOs facing today And how do you guide them through some of these challenges?
Well, I think there's lots of obvious ones that would be the social world that we're dealing with, the technology, et cetera. But I think the thing that I see most frequently, and it's not really a new thing, it's really a frustration with the lack of control they have, in the sense that and the associated overload that comes from that lack of control. They feel like the company is running them and they're not running their company. And this is very common. This is probably one of the most common things I see. And they don't necessarily have a path out of this kind of this place where they're in, but they'd like to get to a place where they're working on their business.
Right.
They're running their business and effectively, but they're not there. And they don't really have a path to get there. I think is one of the most common challenges that I see.
Well said. And, if I want you to ask to step back a little bit and then ask you to look at from 36,000 feet, how has the role of the CEO evolved over the last few decades?
Well, I think the world has gotten more complex, and information moves much more quickly. And I think we've also seen the rise of an educated and talented workforce that is much more demanding about purpose and mission and the reason why they're there, right? So being a CEO has moved from being, long ago, it was basically being an authoritarian. You were the boss, and it was much easier in many ways. You just kind of gave out commands and people did stuff, right?
Yeah.
And it became much more about how do I orchestrate this group of people in a way? How do I actually lead, which is different than telling people what to do? And I think of it as kind of the movement away from the command and control era to the era of creating conditions where people operate and thrive and flourish. And I think the CEO role has had to change to adapt to that. People have had to grow with emotional intelligence, become more empathetic, be able to see why things happen and why people do what they do, and manage. And behavior science is another aspect that's really come along, I think.
Yeah.
It's probably an under-leveraged aspect of what being a CEO is, but a large part of what being a CEO is kind of getting this collection of people to do what needs to be done and doing it well together. It's just very simple. You boil it down to that.
Well said. Well said. And therefore, my logical next question is, what are the key qualities, in your view, of an effective leader in today's rapidly changing business environment?
Well, the first one I would think would be, the first one that always comes to my mind is humility. And I don't want to confuse that with modesty. I don't think you necessarily need to be modest to be a CEO.
Yeah.
But you need to be intellectually humble. You need to be always learning and recognizing that most of what you need to know, you won't know. You'll never have the ability to be the expert in whatever everybody else is the expert at. And so being able to have that humility, being able to leverage other people's talents and skills because you have that humility and you can empathize with them effectively. I think that to me is sort of where I see the really critical aspect of it. Obviously, you need to be a good strategic thinker. You need to be able to, know your numbers and all the kind of technical side of it. But that human aspect of being able to lead people is increasingly kind of what makes I think CEOs stand out. The other thing I would say is, the other word I would come to mind is courage. You have to do something different from the status quo takes a lot of courage, right? And a lot of what I think of as common practices are really bad practices, but they're common, right? So people kind of do what everybody else does, kind of a bit like lemmings, but doing things differently takes courage. I'm always reminded of Steve Jobs when I think of that, in terms of the things that he did and the positions he took and the heat he took, while he was alive doing those things. And along with the courage comes the discipline to say no. That's one of the hardest things I think for a CEO to do, or for anybody to do, is to say no to people who have good ideas and good things to do, but you don't have the capacity to do them. Right? Having the ability to provide discipline around the focus of the organization and keep it on track. Those are the kind of characteristics come to mind for me.
No, great response. Thank you. My next question is, what role, and you spoke of empathy a few minutes ago, what role does empathy play in leadership? And how can leaders develop empathy?
Well, I think it's a little more than empathy to me. I kind of think of it as seeing without the ability to see without judging. It's a little bit, I mean, technically it's phenomenology. It's the ability to see what's actually happening without imposing your own cause and effect on what's happening. I believe is a really important skill for people to have, because when you do that, you can start seeing that things that are going on around you have causes and effects, but often the causes are actually surprisingly things that are good, right? That might cause bad outcomes or bad behaviors, right? A person, might be driving too fast on the freeway, but they might run, they might, cut you off or whatever, and you might be upset with them. But if you actually understood their context and could see what they were dealing with and without judgment, you might actually say, well, that makes a lot of sense. They're doing what they're doing, right? And much of what we see in terms of behaviors, that particularly negative behaviors, are side effects of positive things. And so being able to see without judging, which is in a sense a form of being able to be empathetic and sort of understanding of other people, is an enormously powerful tool for getting to insights about why people are doing what they're doing. And I'm always reminded of a story, which is, I did my startup. I had everybody would tell me why it wouldn't work, and at first I was kind of defensive about it and couldn't, it just felt like people were just kind of piling on. And at some point I started to realize they were telling me these things because they cared, right? And that they had an alternate view of the future. And that there was something I could learn from them, potentially something I could learn from them. And so I started seeing those as opportunities to learn. And it's a little bit of a reframing of things, but it makes a very big difference.
Well said. The other aspect of CEOs, and I've seen this with many people across the world, is the whole challenge of managing complexities in global markets and multicultural teams.
Sure.
I'd love to get your perspective, and how do you support leaders in managing this?
Well, I think technically it's there's a technical aspect to this, right? Which is this is why you have strategy to some extent, right? Because strategy is one of the tools you can use to help people organize in coherent ways together. The second is having good management processes, right? This is more just sort of the plumbing of how you have the conversations you have about what's going on around you, how you make sense, how you get the most out of the people in your team. And then the next bit is really about effective delegation, particularly on a global basis, right? You can't run, India from California, right? You just can't do it, right? So you have to have the ability to delegate to effective people and create structures and organizations that allow for more general management, more points of integration throughout the organization. And those people need to be well connected through strategy, which is why, in many ways, I think of an active strategy is making sure that you've got those people in a place where they're fully understanding what the cause is, what the mission is. And then they can start to act in more coherent ways on a global basis. But those are kind of the technical aspects of it. And to a large extent, working with CEOs is about helping them implement those technical aspects and helping them put those things in place so that it starts to work as a process instead of them trying to be superhuman and try and make it all work themselves.
Well said. The next question that I wanted to get your thoughts on are on failure and risk taking. And as people get more and more senior, they start to get more risk averse.
That's true. I think they start to appreciate the risks more just because they see it from a bigger picture. But I've always been of the mind. I like playing poker, and I like playing blackjack with decks that I can win. So But there's an important principle in both of those cases, which is that you want to make affordable bets to learn, right? So you want to be a fast learner, right? And that's really what you're trying to get out of failure is learning. How can you learn really fast through rapid but small failure, which really relates to this idea of affordable loss, which is how much can I actually afford to lose if I will learn this information from that, from that endeavor. And that's really how I've framed, thinking about this kind, sort of risk taking and sort of what is the affordable loss that makes sense here. And what am I going to get if I do, if I do this experiment, what am I going to get from it? What kind of knowledge am I going to get from it? And making sure that you design what you do in a way that you can learn from it, right? It's at one point in my life, I did a bunch of internet advertising just to learn how it worked. And what you realize is you have no idea at the front end which advertisements are going to work. So most of them are failures, right? But what you're doing is you're actually testing lots of them. If you track the right information, you'll find the winners, right? And then you kind of cut your losses and focus on the ones that are winners. And to a large extent, that's how I think, CEOs should be thinking about risk is how do you make affordable bets that really help you learn much more rapidly so that you can actually then double down when you've actually got much less uncertainty.
Very well said. The other aspect that I have often seen with a lot of CEOs is that they've been outstanding CXOs. And when they're moved into the role of the CEO, they are grappling with how to handle leadership roles and how to give up their existing specialists.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts and how do you support such changes?
A couple of thoughts. Well, the first is making sure that they understand the old adage, right, which is what got you there isn't going to get you where you want to go. Right? I mean, that's kind of the. I think most of them intellectually understand that. And I think that they are looking for ways in which they can deal with uncertainty about things they're just not experts at, right? So when I was a CEO, I had I had 70 people working for me, building brand new sort of state-of-the-art technology, and they were coming to me with all these kinds of buzzwords that I had no idea what they meant, and asking for money, sort of, we need this for that kind of thing, and so you end up having to figure out how do you put in place good people that you trust who have that expertise, right? So trust and expertise become sort of very important tools for you in terms of being able to make good judgments and make good decisions as it relates to those kinds of things. It's but it's the challenge, I think, for people to learn that skill, and that's really an important element of becoming a more general manager, if you will, right? It's being able to trust other people and to build a strong team that you can actually believe in.
Well said. So, Alex, 3 or 4 more questions. One more question relating to coaching and leadership, and then 2 questions for you. My next question is, what role does this entire digital transformation, we've all been bombarded with so much new technology. What role does a digital transformation play? And how do you help leaders prepare for these incredible changes?
Well, my first bit of advice is to drop the digital part. I mean, digital is a tool like any other sort of tool in your portfolio of tools. It's having a profound impact on the world, but it's still just a tool. And really, you want to focus on what the transformation is, then whatever digital part of it should support that transformation. Now, having said that, you need to understand what the possibilities are that the digital starts to enter into the world. How do you play that game in a way that helps you sort of eat up uncertainty and transform uncertainty into information and information into opportunity? That's kind of the pathway here. And I mean, for example, generative AI, for example, right? I mean, it's sort of the buzzword of the day. And the reality is none of us really know what it's going to do. I mean, there's lots of sort of current applications that we can see and touch and use, but predicting the future around is very uncertain. So then the challenge becomes, if you're going to have that kind of uncertainty, how do you build a company that's able to rapidly keep up with whatever that frontier is, right? And thinking about managing the frontier to that to the cutting edge of digital technologies, so that you're actually closer to the frontier than your competitors, in a sense, right? Because every company in the world is probably 10 years behind at the best, right? You're sort of 10 years behind the cutting edge. And to the extent you can get it down to 7, then you're sort of got, a leapfrog ahead of everybody else. And so managing that, the ability to learn, to reduce uncertainty, to generate information that resolves the uncertainty, and then make inference from that about where the opportunities are, becomes kind of a core capability that companies need to be building. And that's a much more cultural thing than really a technology thing. I mean, you definitely need solid technology competencies, but that ability to look at the investment you made of $100 million or whatever in your ERP system and say, well, it's 5 years old and it's supposed to last 20 years, but now it's out of date, right? So how do I sort of cut my losses and move on? That's a kind of very cultural issue. How do you deal with sunk costs? How do you create the psychological safety that it's required to have those kinds of conversations? To me, this is much more about the kinds of cultural transformations that need to take place to be able to cope with the sort of ongoing evolution of digital transformation, if you will.
Well said. So, Alex, we started our conversation with my asking you about your journey, and I'm going to end my conversation with 2 questions for you as a coach. My first question is, how has your own amazing background in consulting, as an entrepreneur, as a corporate leader, how has your background supported your coaching philosophy, your style, and your values?
I'd say that three things that come to mind. One is, the first is the idea that discovered logic trumps delivered logic. And it's always easy to say and it's hard to do. It's supposed to, you want to tell the person the answer, but helping them find the answer is actually much more powerful. A second really important thing that I've learned is human nature tends to follow the status quo, and you need to have the courage to break with the status quo. And there's some very specific things around what I would describe as the divergence between action and espoused logic and espoused theory, which is, we might say things like the team is more important than the individual, right? But then we actually go out and behave like the individual is more important than the team, right? So being able to hold true to to what you believes are, and even in the face of sort of the status quo telling you something else. Those are the things that really sort of have been ingrained in me throughout time. And the last bit that I would say, this is one of the values I remember most from working at Boston Consulting Group, was respect for the individual. Right? Everybody's got something they can bring to the table here. And to the extent that we can respect people, give them meaningful work, they will do amazing things for you. It is just, we should have very high expectations for people, and we tend not to. But if we can give them meaningful work, they will do great things for us.
Fascinating. Alex, my last question for you. How have you been shaped by people in your life, and how are they influencing you as a coach today?
Well, I would go back to my enactive thing, right? Which is, the world is enacting me as I enact it. And the people that I've worked with and had the good fortune of meeting and knowing have really created conditions that helped to evolve my ideas, my thinking, my way of being, that have helped me really become more successful. And I don't know, it's irreplaceable in that sense. It's just, and I think What's really been amazing the last couple of years has just been how much more international and how much more through the things like LinkedIn and the ability to connect to people all over the world.
Yeah.
Has really been tremendous in terms of sort of my personal network growing and finding people who are interested in talking about the kinds of things I'm talking about and can have engaging conversations about them has just been tremendous.
I agree.
We live in a wonderful time. I mean,
Absolutely.
Despite all of our problems, probably
I,
never better time to have been alive,
I agree with you. And on that note, Alex, I just want to say thank you so much for speaking to me about your own journey in such great detail. Thank you for talking to me about coaching. Thank you for talking to me about so many different aspects of leadership. Thank you also for talking to me about chief executive officers, about how they are transitioning, how they are transforming. And of course, I love what you said. The CEOs must have humility and courage. Thank you for speaking to me and good luck.
Thank you. Appreciate the time.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the Brand Called You.